I'm Julie Sweet-Kind-Singer, the Senior Associate University Librarian for Collections and Public Services. It's my pleasure to welcome you in person and to our live audience via Zoom to the 13th Dr. Sam-Chung Hsieh Memorial Lecture today on what would have been the 77th wedding anniversary of Sam and his late wife, Alice. As an intellectual nexus on campus, the Stanford Libraries offer students, faculty, and scholars online and offline environments to explore, investigate, and collaborate. With a network of more than 20 libraries and centers, visitors can engage with primary resources, connect with journals, articles, databases, and data, partner with subject matter experts for assignments and research, and discover ways to access and manipulate collections in digital libraries across the globe. Before we introduce today's speaker, I would like to tell you a bit of history about the Hsieh Memorial Lecture. The family of Dr. Sam-Chung Hsieh, several of whom are tuning in online today, donated his personal archive to the Stanford Library Special Collections and endowed the Dr. Sam-Chung Hsieh Memorial Lecture Series in honor of his legacy and to inspire future generations. Dr. Sam-Chung Hsieh was born on November 13, 1919 in Guangdong, mainland China. He received his PhD in production economics from the University of Minnesota. He began his career with the Sino-American Joint Commission on Rural Reconstruction, JCRR, in Taiwan as senior specialist, chief economist, and later as secretary general. He served as professor at the National Taiwan University and as visiting professor at the Ford Foundation-sponsored University of the Philippines Cornell University Joint Graduate Program. When the Asian Development Bank, ADB, was first established in Manila, Philippines in 1966, he served as director of the projects department until 1981 when he returned to Taiwan to become deputy chairman of the Council for Economic Planning and Development. From 1983 to 1989, he was chairman of the Bank of Communications, Taiwan's National Development Bank. He was appointed governor of the Central Bank of China, a position he held from 1989 to 1994. From 1994 to 1999, he served as the chairman of the executive board of the China Trust Bank. From 1999 to 2003, he served as chairman of the Industrial Bank of Taiwan. Additionally, he served as a member of the Board of Trustees of the International Rice Research Institute, IRRI, a member of the Board of Directors of the Metropolitan Bank and Trust in Manila, Philippines, chairman of the Changhua Institution for Economic Research, and as deputy chairman of the Cross-Straits Exchanges Relations Council with mainland China. Dr. Hsieh was married to Alice Hsieh for 58 years. They have 2 sons, 2 daughters, and 11 grandchildren. He passed away on April 24, 2004 in Los Angeles, California at the age of 85. Here's a listing of the past 12 speakers in this lecture series. As you can see, we have been very fortunate to have an incredible selection of speakers over the years, and we're delighted to include Professor Huang in this group. With that, I will hand it over to Jennifer Chu from SCCEI, Stanford Center on China's Economy and Institutions, to introduce today's guest speaker. Stanford Libraries and SCCEI have been partnering since 2019 to bring the memorial lecture to campus, and we're thrilled to be collaborating again on this year's lecture.
Thank you, Julie. And thank you to the great team at Stanford Libraries for collaborating with us on this great event. It's my honor and my privilege to introduce to you our special guest, Dr. Yasheng Huang. I am Jennifer Chu, Strategic Policy Advisor for the Stanford Center on China's Economy and Institutions, a joint effort of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and also the Stanford Institute on Economic Policy Research. For those of you who do not know the center, let me give you a brief overview. Stanford Center on China's Economy and Institutions, which is also short for SCI, is Stanford's hub for multidisciplinary, data-centric, and empirical research on China's economy. It was started just shy of 3 years ago in 2021 under the directorship of Hongbin Lee and Scott Roselle, who are both in the audience today. And with over 30 faculty affiliates and researchers, it conducts a gamut of research, anywhere from demography to education, environmental quality to health, to firms and productivity, to political economy. So our center strives to committed to data-centric and cutting-edge research, also to provide extraordinary experiences to our students and help the public like yourself better understand China. But before I go on about our center, for which I can go on forever, let me go ahead and introduce our special speaker. Dr. Yasheng Huang is the Epoch Foundation Professor for Global Economics and Management at the MIT Sloan School of Management. Author of 11 books in English and in Chinese, he is one of the foremost foremost expert and scholar on China's political economy, and in particular had a defining role in helping us understand China's transition from plan to market. But in thinking about today's lecture, I was struck by something, which is that we are honoring Dr. Sam-Chung Hsieh, whom we heard was the former governor of the central bank in Taiwan and was instrumental in sparking the Taiwan miracle. And Dr. Huang, in his latest book, has probed deeply into the question that Joseph Needham had asked in the 1960s, which is, how is it that imperial China, that it advanced so far in terms of its own technological inventiveness and science, including paper making and movable print, compass and gunpowder, had actually fallen so far behind the West, and that the Industrial Revolution began in the West and not in China. And so here we are, sitting in the heart of Silicon Valley, honoring Dr. Hsieh. And it seems most apt and fitting that Dr. Huang should be our keynote speaker today. But Dr. Huang does not just rest on imperial China, but he brings the historical analyses to today. We can all agree that China has achieved enormous amounts in terms of economic growth and technological advancement over the last 50 years. And he brings the implications of his historical findings up to not only those reform eras, but up to today, which confronts a very different political environment. So I'm very excited to have Dr. Huang here to speak with us. It should come as no surprise that Dr. Huang is a recipient of many prestigious fellowships and awards, including the Woodrow Wilson Fellowship, the U.S. Peace Institute Fellowship, and also the Social Science Research Council MacArthur Fellowship. Currently, he is faculty member at MIT Sloan School of Management, but previously, he was also a faculty member at the University of Michigan and at the Harvard Business School. So before I bring up Dr. Huang to the podium, I want to go over a couple of housekeeping notes. First, we have people joining in from Zoom, and therefore, I hope that those who are on Zoom will add your questions to the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And those in the audience here in person, please wait for the microphone to be given to you so that those on Zoom can also hear your questions. Dr. Huang will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we will open it up to public Q&A. This event is being recorded, and the recording will be available to you soon after the event. Thank you very much. Dr. Huang.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for the introduction. It is always a tremendous pleasure for me to come to Stanford, in part because my brother graduated from Stanford, and like other Stanford graduates, he went into business, and he made tons of money, leaving me much behind. So I second guess my own decision. I went into academia, and for many, many years, Chenggang and I went to graduate school together, and we have been discussing the issues that we're going to present, I'm going to present for many, many years. Let me also say it is my great honor to present the 2023 Memorial Lecture, Sam-Chung Hsieh's Memorial Lecture. And I do agree with Jennifer that it is a fitting topic and fitting theme in the middle of Silicon Valley to talk about technology. But I go back to history, and then the title is Lessons of History, the Rise and Fall of Chinese Technology in History. And I do believe, and I'm going to end on that note, the lessons and the takeaways we draw from history are still relevant to China today. And there, we think about and speculate about the future. And this is where history is very useful, because history, by definition, has already happened. And history doesn't always repeat itself, but it rhymes with itself. So it is useful to draw lessons and takeaways from history. So it's in that spirit that I'm going to make my presentation. And let me just say that this is a collaborative effort with professors mostly in China, and Zheng from Peking University, she was my student at MIT, Wei Hong from Tsinghua University, and Dan Ziliao from Zhejiang University of Economics and Finance, and Mason Sun, who is assistant professor at University of Illinois, also my former student at MIT. And we have a contract with Princeton University Press. And today I'm going to present the main findings from this research project. And later I'm going to introduce our database. And that database itself took us 6 years to construct. Okay? And Jennifer mentioned the book that I just published. I recommend it, and especially if you buy it. And as a business school professor, I care about whether or not you buy it. I don't care whether you read it, but as an intellectual, I also hope you're going to read it. One chapter of this book is on historical technology, and then we are devoting an entire book to that subject matter because it is so important, it's so complicated, and that one chapter simply does not do sufficient treatment and justice to this enormously important topic. So the outline of the book is such. The red lined 2 chapters are the ones we have finished. And Jennifer mentioned Joseph Needham. Joseph Needham in 1969 asked the famous question, how come China was so much ahead and then it fell behind the West and it didn't have its own industrial revolution? So in our chapter 1, we reframe that question, and then we propose our own way of thinking about that question. And then we go through the technological trajectories and the developments from 5th century BCE all the way to 19th century. As I'm going to show in my presentation, that the technological development was a very uneven one, but over time it trended downward and then collapsed. So China did collapse before. Whether or not it is going to decline, whether or not it is going to collapse, I think depends a lot on human agency, on policymakers, on politics, on global environment. So I'm not going to make predictions about the future, but it is very, very important to keep in mind that collapse did happen in China historically. And then in the last chapter, we drew broad implications of our findings and bring the findings to China today. So that's the book. For this presentation, I'm going to push along because I only have 30 minutes. I'm going to highlight our findings. And the idea there is that if you don't remember anything, I hope you remember the highlights. And then this is data-driven. So I do need to introduce our data set, our database, and I do need to introduce our measurements. To an academic audience, we typically devote 90% to that topic. Findings are less time-consuming, but I may speed through because I do want to get to the end. And then we asked and tried to answer this question: why did Chinese technology decline? Right? It is purely from our way of reading the data. It is not based on ideological priors. It is not based on social science training. It is really just reading the data, draw the conclusions. The way that I want to emphasize that is because we still want to have a voice in China today, right? And I do want, let me just say where we ended up in our book. The way that we ended up in our book, based on our reading of the data, is that China had vibrant technological development when China was more free, okay? When there was more competition, political competition, ideological competition, less of economic competition, but mostly ideological competition and political competition, right? So there will be people who say, oh, this is ideological, it is based on Western liberal values. No, it's actually based on Chinese own history. So I do want to make that point so that it is easier to have that conversation with our friends and colleagues in China to really emphasize the empirical approach of our project rather than the ideological assumptions. And then I'm going to talk about the lessons and the takeaways, okay? So let me give the highlight, right? Basically, if you look at the trajectory of Chinese technology from 5th century BCE to 19th century, right, roughly 2,500 years, there are three kind of distinct eras of Chinese technology. The peak was from the 4th century BCE, right, roughly kind of Warring States period, to 6th century, right, which is the beginning of the Sui dynasty, Sui and Tang. That was the peak. Right. Everything since then is a long process of decline. Okay? The first decline began in 6th century, and roughly it was a one-time decline, and then it roughly held up at a fairly high level, at a lower level compared with the previous era, but at a high level until about 13th century, right? So that's about 700 years. And then there was another massive decline from 13th century to 19th century, right? So basically Ming Dynasty and Qing Dynasty. So our findings show that the Chinese technology peaked much earlier than conventional wisdom assumed to be, right? So just on that, I believe the project is interesting and valuable. We can debate about, is that the right interpretation or not? But just to get the date right, I believe is massively important. Most historians, I believe, argue, I would say believe rather than argue. Argue means that you state your point of view based on the data, but mostly believe that the Chinese technology began to decline much later, right? Maybe 14th century, 15th century, and some, including Joseph Needham himself, believed that the decline began in 16th century and 17th century. So our dating is 1,000 years earlier than the previous scholarship suggested. So that means that is important. And the next slide, I'm going to get into that. That means that we have to look for other independent variables and other dynamics to understand the reason why Chinese technology declined, right? So why does it matter, right, to get this right? Well, I think to get it right itself is important, but suppose you don't believe that, then let me convince you that there are other reasons why we need to get it right. The most important thing is to get the causation right, right? So if you believe that Chinese technology began to decline in 15th century, mostly economic historians sort of have that timeline. They point to trade closures, right? The famous ban on voyages, and protectionism. So they would point to those factors as causing the decline because they believe that decline began in the 15th century, and those actions happened in 15th century. And then if you believe that the decline began in 17th century, historians point to science, the role of science. But if you actually read those works carefully, it is actually not based on reading Chinese history. It is based on reading European history. So 16th and 17th century, what happened? The rise of science in the West. So it's not really about the Chinese decline. It is really about the Western, the rise of the West. So actually, if you read modern economic debates on how science played or didn't play in the Industrial Revolution, it is by no means clear that science was that important in terms of explaining Western Industrial Revolution. So let alone the absence of it, let alone explaining the Chinese lack of Industrial Revolution. If you believe that the decline happened during the Ming and Qing dynasties, then you would argue that it was because these dynasties suppressed commerce, right? So essentially cut off the demand side of the technology, right? And many people believe that commerce and economic development raised the demand for technology, and Industrial Revolution happened that way. And the other conventional view is that the two dynasties in China represented the peak of Chinese civilization. Right? The Tang Dynasty, very famous Tang Dynasty, and the Song Dynasty, right? And because these dynasties are associated with technology and birth of literature, and they are empires. So the political elites like these dynasties because these are empires, these are autocratic empires, and they believe that the empires are conducive to technological development. Later, I'm going to show that these two dynasties are inventive, but they pale in comparison relative to the previous period when China was not an empire, when China was a collection of small kingdoms, when there was mobility of human capital, when there was a diversity of ideas, right? So I'm not denying these two dynasties to be inventive. What I'm saying is that they are far less inventive as compared with China when China was much more free. So the 6th century dating kind of at least cast doubt on these previous theories or explanations, right? because all these things happened together with a decline, so they may be concurrent epiphenomenal with the technological decline. But usually when you say A causes B, A kind of has to happen before B, right, as a necessary condition to establish causality. If these things happen after the decline, then we have question about whether or not these explanations are correct, right? So what happened in 6th century, right? So I would argue that everything is about politics. Everything is about the transition of China from a politically more competitive state of affairs to a autocratic state of affairs. And 6th century was the turning point, the Sui dynasty. So Sui dynasty is a short dynasty established in the late 6th century, reunified China, but that's actually less important than the fact that this Sui dynasty put China on a permanent path toward a unified empire. So if you look at the period before Sui dynasty and the period after Sui dynasty, before Sui dynasty, there was a period of reunification. There was also a period of disunity, right? In fact, the amount of the time that China was in a state of disunity far surpassed the amount of the time that China was in unity before the Sui dynasty. After that, the ratio switched, right? So China also experienced a short period of disunity, but majority of that time, China was a unified empire. And today, China basically is a legacy of the Sui dynasty. Right? A single government replaced a constellation of smaller kingdoms beginning in 6th century. And this is kind of the central part of my current book. Sui dynasty launched Keju system, the civil service exam system. And that exam system did a number of things, as I laid out in my book. It homogenized the Chinese ideology, right? Before the Keju system, there was Confucianism, there was legalism, Taoism, Buddhism. But Keju famously monopolized the ideological space by mandating Confucianism as the only curriculum. Right? It stifled the Keju, for anybody who has the pleasure of knowing Keju, it was extremely rigid, right? Pure memorization. Right? And one scholar suggested that to pass Keju, you need to commit 300,000 to 400,000 characters to your memory. Right? I think Stanford students are pretty smart. MIT students are pretty smart. I challenge, majority of Stanford students, majority of MIT students can memorize 300,000 characters faithfully, right? So essentially, you spend all your mental energy and time on memorization at the expense of coming up with a new idea, coming up with creativity, coming up with cognitive diversity, right? So it stifled creativity. And actually, it stifled curiosity, because every answer is given to you rather than having you come up with the answer, right? When you are being trained like that, you basically lose curiosity. A consolidated power of the emperor, right? Partially by, and this is an incredible political change in China in 6th century, which is that if you recruit human capital on the basis of the exam, you sidelined and marginalize other metrics. Right? If you look at Europe, what was the promotion path in Europe? It was based on your bloodline, right? Hereditary characteristics, your family, your relatives, and China, and this is really, really remarkable achievement. It was it was meritocratic, right? A sidelined aristocracy, right? If you read the history of Western Europe, how Europe became more diversified politically and ideologically, aristocracy actually played a very important role in that historical process. So essentially, Keju sidelined and marginalized one crucial actor who over time had a political capital, financial capital to challenge the sovereign. And therefore, Keju, I would argue, was the mechanism why China was able to maintain autocracy for such a long period of time, eliminating almost all the competition. Right? So that's what happened in the 6th century. Right? So basically, that's the highlight of our book, right? 3 eras. The peak happened before 6th century, and then there were 2 substantial declines. The way we arrive at that reading of the history is based on our data set, right? The Chinese Historical Invention Database. And there are 2 source materials that we used. One is by Joseph Needham, Science and Civilization of China. I think the first volume came out in 1955. The last volume came out in something like 1995, right? There were 27 volumes of them, right? Joseph Needham, for those who don't know, was a Cambridge professor. He was a biochemist by training, but he became a historian of science. And he single-handedly, well, not single-handedly, but he had research assistants and colleagues, essentially collected a record of Chinese technologies through the publication of Science and Civilization of China. And then we also went to Chinese Academy of Sciences. They published the history of Chinese science and technology. So we use these 2 as our source materials. It is actually a very difficult job because when they record the Chinese inventions, they don't really create a table. It is just describing these inventions, and so our research assistants had to go through the text and pick out the information that way. I wish I could tell you that it's because of ChatGPT and machine learning. It is all done by manual labor. And we had a lot of manual labor. We have 44 researchers at Tsinghua. It took us 6 years. And then we had 10 researchers at MIT who matched the inventions to dynasties, to centuries. And also we have a lot of ambiguities, right? So we developed algorithms to assign these inventions to Han Dynasty, to Ming Dynasty, depending on information that was not very clear, very ambiguous, right? So this is what we did. It took us 6 years. The initial run is that now we have about 10,350 entries in our database. Just to give you a flavor of, this is not big data, right? So you say, wow, 10,000, that doesn't sound like a lot. But the previous data set that I know of has only 600. Right. So relative to that, well, first of all, there were probably only 10,000 inventions in China, so we couldn't make it big data. So relative to 600, we have made a massive improvement. So this is what our research assistants did, right? So they had to read the whole thing and then pick up the information from the text. So the way that we define invention is very straightforward. Whatever Joseph Needham says it is invention, we say it is invention. We have no independent judgment. And sometimes I do get questions from scholars who, at MIT, we have quite a few of those, who study innovation, right? Say, oh, how come this is invention, that is not invention? No. We just, we have to build on the shoulders of the giants. And I'm not going to second guess Joseph Needham. And after all, I do want to finish the book rather than spending 30 years to clean the data. So essentially, there are 4 kind of categories: discovery, technical gadget, scientific theory, production method. Right? And we don't really distinguish between science and technology. We don't really distinguish between inventions and innovations. Right? In terms of measures, we have inventions, right? Count of inventions, right? Say the Qing Dynasty has, say, 800 inventions. Right? The modern way of measuring a country's technological achievement is to scale it by population, right? Patents per capita, something like that. So what we do is that we have 2 ways. One is that we use dynasty as the time unit, right? So the average population in one dynasty, right, as the denominator, and then we have the count of inventions for that dynasty as the numerator. So essentially a version of per capita inventions, except the population here is measured in million persons rather than in one person. So for the Qing Dynasty, it is 2.85. It means during the Qing Dynasty, of 1 million people in Qing, they came up with, on average, 2.85 inventions. Tang Dynasty was much more inventive, right? For 1 million people in the Tang Dynasty, they came up with about 18 inventions. The other way we do it is by centuries, right? Kind of average population during a century, right? And then we divide the average count of inventions of that century by that population figure. So these are our 2 measures. So it's kind of a density measure. And then, fortunately, we drew from really fantastic work by Chinese historians on Chinese historical populations, right? And it's actually impressively comprehensive. So we benefited from the work by the Chinese historical demographers. So there are many measurement issues, usually if I give a seminar here, the people will say, stop, let me ask you about these issues. One is that, different dynasties have different length, right? If you scale them, that's not quite right. And also, population sizes differ across different dynasties, right? And it is true that the later dynasties tend to have bigger populations. So it's this mathematical construct that you show a decline simply because the later dynasties have more population, right? The biggest issue for us, those are actually not terribly difficult to resolve. The biggest issue is this one, right? We kind of assume each invention to be roughly as important as every other invention, right? And then, as I said before, Song Dynasty, although quite inventive, was not nearly as inventive as compared with the previous era. But people immediately say, how can you say that? Song Dynasty invented 3 of the 4 most important technologies in the history of mankind, right? Compass, gunpowder, and printing, right? Paper was invented during the Han Dynasty. So even though quantitatively Song doesn't appear as impressive as the previous era, Song invented these important technologies. So that's actually the hardest question for us, and we have thought about a number of solutions to that, okay? So let me go through this quickly because I only have a few minutes left. Let me just, I'll be happy to get to that if people want to ask me that question. all I can say is that none of these complications change the qualitative features of our conclusion. They're going to change the numerical value for sure, right? But they are not going to change the fundamentals of our conclusions, okay? So whether you scale by population or you scale by the duration of the dynasty, you see exactly the same pattern, right? 5 minutes, okay? So you see the same pattern, right? The population size, we can actually have a debate on that. And the idea that larger population automatically is associated with less creativity, that's kind of a Malthusian view, which is not really supported by data. And also, if you look at other countries, if you look at history of mankind, the population increases by and of themselves do not reduce creativity, right? We have far more population today than 18th century, but we have far more creativity. Usually, actually, the bias is the other way around. Usually, the bias is more people, more ideas, right? So there's really, this is not about doing math. This is try to capture the process of human creativity. More people is usually associated with more creativity, with more inventiveness, right? So conceptually, that criticism is actually quite weak. So let me get to the equal weighting issue, right? So this is our solution. So, okay, so that's a fair criticism that some inventions are more important than others. So what we do is that we adopted two approaches. One is the unweighted approach and the other is weighted approach. We weight what historians consider to be important inventions more than other inventions, right? And we come up with arbitrary weights, right? 50 times, 100 times, right? We go to these sources. One is a book written by Robert Temple. He lists 100 most important breakthrough inventions in the history of China, right? So this is the table that he has. And then we go to a second source published by the Chinese Academy of Sciences. They list about 88 most important inventions in Chinese history. And then we match these inventions with the inventions mentioned in the Needham volumes. And then we just gave them more weights, right? We gave them 50 times, we gave them 100 times. And let me show you the pattern. This is basically the pattern, right? The yellow line represents a weighted measure, right? Important inventions are given a weight of 50. The red line represents unweighted measure, right? So if you look at the trend, they gave you identical trends. Right? So I hope that at least I can persuade you that even though the measure is not perfect, the measure has issues and problems, but we have at least tried to solve these problems by doing these tricks. Okay, so let me quickly conclude when I'm only halfway through my presentation. So the three eras, right? So this graph breaks down the history by giving you the dynasties, right? The warring states, the Qing and the Han, and this is our that's the period I like the most. I don't know if those who are from China read the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, right? 三国演义. That was that period. The most inventive period in Chinese history was during the Three Kingdom period. And then Hsieh did something to it, right? This is Tang. This is 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms. This is Song dynasty. And when I talk to people who study Arabic civilization, they always blame the decline of Islamic civilization on the Mongols. And I think we can do it here too. Yuan, this is the Yuan dynasty, right? And then Ming dynasty and Qing dynasty, okay? So as I said before, Tang and Song, they look good, right? These are the two dynasties. But compared with the previous era, it is already, China already began the process of decline. So it is not a peak. It is a declining portion of Chinese history. So this is my favorite period, the Three Kingdom period, right? In the official terminology, it is called Weijin Nanbei Chao, right? Weijin and Southern and Northern Dynasty. It is actually not a period that historians pay a lot of attention to. It turned out to be incredibly interesting period in our book. So this is actually a Stanford professor, Walter Hsieh. He wrote this really interesting book about how the collapse of Roman Empire kind of liberated European, unleashed European creativity and energy. And I call this era of China from 220 to 580 China's European moment. Right? It is actually very similar to Europe after the Roman Empire collapsed in 476. Very similar. Right? A lot of wars, a lot of intellectual creativity, human capital mobility, right? And also the intellectual class was relatively independent of the political class. So China, for that period, actually had an independent intellectual class. We also had data on literature, right? Yeah, literature. And this is a European picture, right? When the literature peaked, it was also when technology peaked, right? So basically, this is kind of a Renaissance story. And these were some of the notable inventions. Math was very developed during this period. Two of the pure mathematicians in Chinese history, Liu Hui and Zhu Chongzhi, lived in this era, right? In terms of numerical value, it represented the second peak of the importance of math relative to other inventions. And these are some of the other inventions. And then I use ChatGPT to translate and to explain what they are. We don't have to go through the details, but it's quite diverse. There are some military technologies. There are technologies that, I like to eat vinegar, and now I know vinegar was invented during that period. Food preservatives were invented during that period, right? How to use natural gas, right? So it was a period of really very diverse inventions. The reason why I emphasize diversity is for the following reason. The reason is that was also during a period of war, right? So arguably you can say, oh, it's just a military technology, but that's actually not true. Military technology was a piece of creativity, but then the span of inventions was much wider than military technologies. Okay. So the Warring States period was the second peak, right? And Warring States period, most people are more familiar with, right? It was divided into 7 kingdoms, a lot of intellectual freedom, right? The 100 flowers bloom, and Confucius and others roam around the different kingdoms, and so there was a lot of human capital mobility. Okay? So let me conclude by summarizing some of the main takeaways and lessons from studying history. These are the things we believe at least are associated with technological decline. And we can go further and say they are causally linked with technological declines, rise of empires, political unitarianism, right? Ideological conformity, and let me skip that. So this graph maps the technological development with the political development, right? So on this side of the graph, lot of political fragmentation, lot of intellectual fragmentation, and then beginning around 6th century, you have political unification, ideological diversity began to decline. And then let me just also explain that we also have constructed database on ideologies using these materials. These are biographies of 10,000 most prominent historical figures in China. We track their ideological beliefs as a way to track the decline of Buddhism, Taoism, and the rise of Confucianism. And that timeline, the ideological timeline, matches very closely with the second technological decline. The political unification matches with the first decline. The ideological unification matches with the second decline. Okay. So let me finish quickly going to the today, right? So I think, in my presentation, more than in the book, I emphasize the importance of diversity, what I call scope conditions, right? But I just want to emphasize it is also important for a country to succeed technologically, scientifically, also to have scale, right? The level of the government support, the level of the government commitment to science and technology, you need both. You need both. In our book, we actually also show evidence on the scale, how the imperial government supported science, but today I didn't have time to go into that. So, but I just want to make sure, I don't want to kind of just give one view. Both of them are important. So Chinese history and today, I believe, is a case study of getting both things right when technology and science develop fast, and getting it wrong when the scale completely went to the extreme and undermines the scope, right? And you need both, right? So if all you have is government support without any diversity, you don't succeed technologically and scientifically. But the conventional view in the West about why China has succeeded in the last 40 years in entrepreneurship, in high-tech entrepreneurship, in technology, is that the government has this massive program, right? Made in China 2025, and R&D spending as a proportion of GDP exceeding, number of developed countries roughly around 2%. Almost no developing country will spend money on R&D in excess of 2%. China is the only developing country that does that. I'm not denying R&D spending is important. It is very important. But China achieved its success in the last 40 years also because China has liberalized its economy, has established collaborations with the West, has established academic collaborations with Stanford and with MIT and with other universities. There's brain circulation, right? So Chinese students going back to China, Chinese business people coming to the United States. So you can sort of conceptualize these activities as collaboration between China and the West. Before 2018, before Trump administration imposed tariff on China, Huawei collaborated with 120 American companies. Huawei's phone has excellent camera. It developed its camera in collaboration with Zeiss from Germany, right? Huawei is a classic example of international collaboration, right? So it is very important to emphasize the collaborative aspects of Chinese success rather than simply looking at the government support and the government R&D spending. And this is my last bullet point. And I have to end it there, right? So that's my worry, right? If you look at, what is happening in China, right? The collaboration with the West, whether you blame China or blame the United States, the simple fact is that the collaboration has come down substantially, right? I don't know about Stanford, but at MIT it has come down substantially. Business collaboration has come down substantially, right? And China is now trying to recreate its own semiconductor supply chain, right, without international collaboration. And other conditions, I haven't even mentioned ideological closure of the country. I believe that no matter how much the government spends on R&D, without these collaborative features of Chinese economy, I worry about the prospects of technology and science in China in the future, drawing purely from history of China rather than from ideology. But that's about the future. I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but I'm willing to say that I'm willing to say I'm worried. Okay, so that's all I want to say. Thank you very much.
But I was wondering, in some ways, your story historically sounds like it's about how there was a closing of the imperial Chinese mind and sort of the diversity of ideology that shrinks and things of that sort. But I did peek into your book, so I know a little bit about this. But the mechanism that you point to is Keju, as being very determinative in many ways. And I was wondering, because ideas and ideology, contestation of idea can actually come through the borders, right? Come through the external borders, such as from Hong Kong and from different individuals bringing in like Buddhism from India or whatnot. And even the Yuan and the Qing were foreign powers. Yeah. Could you flesh out a little bit more beyond the 300,000 characters that people have to memorize? And then just very quickly, in the interest of time, we'll just go on to the audience Q&A afterwards.
Yeah. So that's an excellent question. There are two kinds of closures. One is cognitive closures. The other is policy closure. And both were in effect when Keju system was introduced, when autocracy became more severe in the history of China. The cognitive closure is actually easy to explain, right? So you just spend so much mental energy on one subject. It is just, without any policy interventions, it is just so much more difficult for you to spend comparable amount of mental energy on other ideas. So the Keju, in my book, I went into some details describing the Keju system. Keju system at the beginning was relatively broad. So they had, exams on Confucianism, but they also had exams on medicine, on military skills. But by Song, it began to systematically eliminate these other components of the curriculum. And Yuan Dynasty did one thing that was quite remarkable. They adopted what is known as a neo-Confucianism, the most rigid version of Confucianism, right? So just having Confucianism itself is not enough. Let's have like the most restrictive version of Confucianism. By Ming Dynasty, there was this famous 8-legged essay, right, Baguwen. Baguwen is really restrictive, right? So it's restrict the format, restrict the expressions. So gradually, Keju became extremely restrictive and also tremendously demanding on your time, energy, and mental capacity, right? So that's a kind of a cognitive closure. In terms of policy closure, I go back to the conventional historical, traditional historical accounts. The trade closure, I think that was a big factor. And trade closure was issued in the early 15th century, but it lasted for 400 years. right? So even the Qing dynasty renewed the voyage ban. And the Jesuits, right, did go to China, that's true. Jesuits, I don't know how to pronounce that word properly, Jesuits, yeah. So they did interact with Chinese society. But if you read the history of Western Jesuits in China at that time, their activities were highly restricted. Was it Qianlong or Guangxu? They had these Western private tutors teaching them science and math, but they would tell them, do not teach these things outside of the palace, right? So there's both the cognitive and policy closure, and the interactions with the outside world was very minimum. If you look at the data on Buddhism, Buddhism began to collapse at the end of the Tang Dynasty. Taoism began to collapse around the beginning of the Ming Dynasty, right? So we have some measures of these things. So essentially, by 14th century or so, you had only one ideology left. That's it.
Got it. Great answer. So I think in the interest of time, it'd be great if we could group together some questions from the audience. And I will also be screening the Zoom questions that are coming through my phone. So perhaps we could group together maybe three or four questions, and you can go ahead and answer them.
If I can remember them, yeah.
Okay.
I didn't take Kuzhu, so I have a terrible memory. Yeah.
Hard to believe that. So back there, you with the blue shirt.
Thank you so much for the excellent session. My name's Greg Tarr. I've lived out in Greater China, Korea, and Japan for 16 years doing international trade for Silicon Valley technology companies. And I wanted to talk more commercially and just get your thoughts around the next 3 or 4 years. We're faced with some big restrictions for international trade. And my take on the situation is Southeast Asia benefits big time. And I'm seeing that in Vietnam, Thailand, and Singapore. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how we can resolve the pressure, because we can actually all work together in a positive manner. That includes Taiwan, China, Japan, Korea, US, particularly around the automotive industry. And it's getting a little bit of tension. I want to get your thoughts. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else?
I'm really curious because in your work, you deal more on the level of dynasties, which is we deal on the hundreds of years level, whilst when it comes to lessons from history, we're looking at the realm of economic policy, in which we're not really thinking that far. So I'm really curious what you think of, to what extent these lessons that you draw from this massive periodization can be miniaturized for the Xi Jinping era.
Okay, one more.
Sorry, I have kind of different questions. If you need me to remind, I can repeat myself later. But the first one is that it's more academic. I was quite amazed by the data divided by the number of population, density, as well as time. But one thing as a technology investor myself, I've noticed over the past couple technology revolution is that the time span of each technology revolution has been shrinking as well. So the velocity of the technology advancement has been picking up exponentially, right? So how do we account for that in this study? Because in the earlier years, it might take hundreds years to develop. Now it can be decades or years, right? That's question number one. Number two is regarding, again, another academic scale is that you talk about scale and scope. I can't stop thinking that which one is more important? Because if I'm looking at, in the recent history about countries as small as Taiwan with 24 million population, they developed amazing semiconductor industry. Small state countries like Israel, they also have amazing technologies, right? So between the two, which one is more important? Is it scale or the scope?
Would you like to take one more, or is that?
Well, there are 4 questions because he asked 2, right?
Go for it, Go for it.
I don't want to show my memory is bad. So let me sort of maybe answer in the reverse order, right? Israel, Taiwan. So remember, those economies are extremely export-oriented, right? And so they are not just selling to the domestic market. And Israel, they usually sell, I mean, one criticism of Israel is that they sell too early, right? So the startups are being bought by American companies, by European companies. Essentially, the scaling happens outside of the country. And then the technologists there go back and invent a new technology. So I don't think these two examples contradict, the scale part of the equation. In terms of exponential, the very definition of lack of scientific takeoff is lack of exponential pattern in technological development, right? So exponential growth is a result of ideas interacting with each other, right? So it's not 1 + 1, it is multiplication, even more than that, right? So the exponential growth requires ideas and technologies working with other ideas and with other technology. China in the ancient times simply didn't have any kind of institutional apparatus to create these interactive possibilities, right? So it's not surprising. The pattern that I show, sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down. Clearly, this is not exponential growth. The Western pattern before Industrial Revolution is similar to that. So the issue is really how you can have some growth of, this is a Needham puzzle, right? So how can you have some early growth, even though it's not exponential? How come that? So if I translate Needham's question into your question, the question basically is, how come that pattern didn't translate into exponential growth, right? So my answer is, ideology, political closure, and things like that. In terms of the lessons, how I miniaturize, I don't know how I can miniaturize these lessons. I'm not sure I understood your question correctly. Are you saying that these are two? Oh, the present day. Okay, so I think so. I think one thing, if we believe in this pattern, then the idea, the overall takeaway is that China's success is no different from success in Europe. Technology takes off under similar conditions, whether it is in China or in Europe or in America, right? So the policy lesson is, okay, if your policy is so much against that system, which is okay, right? That's your policy preferences. Then I would argue that then you should be prepared to give up the upside from technological development. And in today's world, that's a big upside to give up on, right? And my view is that, ChatGPT was probably not going to be born in China, but China had an opportunity to develop very advanced fintech. But that was basically killed by a political decision, right? And this idea that somehow you go after internet companies without hurting hard tech. I mean, the whole idea now about data is that data can be used, for software and all of that, but also for hard tech, for life science, right? So if you look at the data scientists, it's very interesting, right? ChatGPT was developed by a company rather than by university. If you look at the top-ranked data scientists in the United States, they're actually not at Stanford. They're not at MIT. They're in Google. They're in companies, right? So by going after Ant Financial, right, and other platform economies, you actually go after companies that probably have a better opportunity to use data science, to apply data science in finance, in other areas, right? But the policymakers' view is, these are internet companies. I want to develop a semiconductor. In fact, there could be connections between the data developed through the internet platforms and these hardware technologies, right? On Southeast Asia, I think if you look at the trade statistics between China and the United States, China is, where's the questioner? Okay, you're still here, so let me just make sure that it can be useful to you. And the China today is no longer the largest trading partner for the United States. Roughly in the last 4 years, the trade share from China of the US imports declined by about 6%, 6 percentage points. 6 percentage points are 6% of the US imports, which is about $3.2 trillion. It's a massive amount of money that China has given up because of decoupling and de-risking and all these things, geopolitical tensions. Of that 6%, 4% went to Canada and Mexico, right? So Mexico today is a very large, maybe the bigger trading partner with the US than China. The other 2% went to Vietnam. So you mentioned Southeast Asia. Vietnam has a very small economy. 2% of the US imports is a huge percentage of Vietnamese economy. This is a pure gift to Vietnam from China because of these political, geopolitical tensions. And the thing that we know about globalization is that globalization tends to happen slowly. Actually, that's true for both globalization and deglobalization. They tend to happen slowly, gradually. Once they happen very fast. Okay? So there's one idea that, Vietnam is too small to replace China. Right? That's true. But actually, if you're talking about exports, the right way to think about replacement is not whether Vietnam can replace China. The right question is whether Vietnam can replace Guangdong. That's the analytically right way to think about that question. Right? Guangdong and Zhejiang and maybe Jiangsu, right? So, if that's the replacement target, well, Vietnam has a chance. Mexico has a chance, right? So this idea, China is too big, we have infrastructure and all of that, we are not replaceable. That's just not true, right? And also infrastructure. Infrastructure is actually the result of economic growth. A lot of business people believe that infrastructure is the reason for growth. China didn't have decent infrastructure until the late 1990s, and yet it had 20 years of rapid GDP growth. Once you have GDP growth, you have the money, you have the savings, you have the government revenue, then you have the engineering capabilities, you can build infrastructure. So this idea that China is big, China has world-class infrastructure, and therefore China is not replaceable. I don't buy it. I don't buy it. Okay? So I don't know if that's good news for you or bad news for you, but that's my bottom line. Yeah.
So this Q&A is going so well. I'm wondering, can we go for another few minutes? Is that allowed? Or okay, great. So maybe just one more batch of questions. Would that be okay?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that gentleman, Matt, in the green shirt. I think there's a microphone coming.
I know Matt from graduate school. Yeah.
It's good to see you, Yasheng.
We play basketball together. And you can tell who usually won.
Who could argue the best? Usually was the dictator of who won. You won. Could you be considered a technology of, can a door that closes be seen as a technology? Can a camera that surveils, that produces homogeneity in behavior, be seen as a technology?
Yeah.
So in brief, what would it look, couldn't we flip this around even and say that actually if you start to consider those things as technologies, that starting in this way, China started to develop all of these technologies that became very productive for certain kinds of social formation.
Sure.
Yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay. Yeah.
Let me ask one from the Zoom, actually. So there's a question regarding, because there is creative destruction, inventions that happened during the Warring States period and the interaction between Han and the Hsieh. The question is, do you think that periods of war, conflict cause inventiveness, or is there a way in which it tips over, too much violence actually stymies this creative destruction?
Sure.
Yeah. And anyone else from the audience? Over.
I was given a microphone, so I'm just going to ask the question. I'm a PhD student in the communication department. The way that I interpreted your story was that political action resulted in these scientific changes to inventiveness, and I'm wondering to what extent you looked at the reverse relationship. So the scientific inventions causes the political changes.
Okay.
One more?
Yeah, so my question is that did you see any patterns of the types of industries when you looked at the inventions of along the so many centuries, one? And secondly, did you see any impact of religious orientations or orientations on those lines on how science and technology was affected or not?
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So whether Kudri is a technology, I think we could do that. We can label them in such a way. But the usual way we think about technology is that technology liberates rather than restricts, right? So if you think about ChatGPT, enables lots of bad things too, right? But enables research, in life science, and right. So I think I would probably prefer to go with that conception of technology, right? Technology usually is an enabling device, right? Cars enable us to go further than horses, right? Tanks enable us to kill more people than cannons. So I don't feel comfortable labeling. I would label them as inventions. And these are remarkable inventions, by the way. The Kudri, we did a study of Kudri. It really, really was meritocratic. Our data came from the Ming Dynasty, right? So this is before modern communication, before modern times. It kind of worked the way that it was designed to work. That's remarkable. But technology, I don't know. I mean, if I could label it that way. And then there's where's the second person who asked the question? No, there's a religion. Yeah. So the communication essentially reverse causality, right? Technology causing politics. I think that's plausible, but you have to give me a story, right? And my story is straightforward. And there are also books now on Islamic civilization that tell essentially the same story, right? So how technology, this is actually related to mass question, right? So technology causing closure rather than openness, that usually is not the traditional way we think about technology, right? Think about how internet can set our minds free. It did set our minds free, but in a very destructive way, right? But the freedom part is not disputable. I mean, so now you are free to have whatever opinions that you have, enabled by technology. So the story from politics to technology, the reversal story, that is a story that is, so I try to overturn some conventional explanations, but I don't want to overturn all of them. So this one I accept. But maybe you have a different story. So I think it's easier for me to answer this question by knowing your logic rather than simply knowing your question. On religion, it is interesting, right? I just finished reading the biography of Oppenheimer, and Oppenheimer was not religious, but he was a deep believer in Hinduism, right? Sort of mystique of the universe, mystique of life. Buddhism had that. Taoism had that. Joseph Needham said that Taoism was very observational. Buddhism was very much metaphysical, right? Having to do with your mind, your brain, right? These are maybe modern renditions of Buddhism, but Buddhism was very much sort of looking inward and exploring the universe. They didn't survive Keji. The one that survived and prospered is Confucianism. Confucianism, I don't know if there are Confucianists in the room. If they are, I apologize. Confucianism is the least mysterious, the least metaphysical, and the least logic-based, logic-driven, right? Among these three other contending ideologies, right? So if the survivor is the one that is most antithetical to science, right? I'm not surprised by what happened. And it is so there are actually psychological experiments on people who grew up in a Confucianist culture. One of the key things to do science is thinking clearly about causality. There's experimental evidence to show that if you sort of grew up in a Confucianist cultural tradition, the causal framework is messy, let me put it that way, right? So very often you kind of end up on both sides of the equation without even knowing that you're on both sides of the equation. It's okay to end up on both sides of the equation if you know it, and you make a decision to do it that way. But the experimental research shows that they don't even know. So essentially, they don't have this hypothesis generation process. So I would argue, although we don't really make a big deal of that, Confucianism is probably the least friendly to science, but it's the one that survived and then prospered. So, yeah, that's not good. Yeah. But if you want a Confucianist society, that's excellent, right? So there's nothing wrong with that. But if you want a scientific society, that's not the way to get there. Yeah.
So I think the last question.
And by the way, I don't know many scientists who are Confucianists. I know scientists who are Buddhists, Hinduists. I don't know many who are Confucianists.
I feel as though we're going into dangerous territory here. But
I know, yeah. So, okay, I didn't say any of that, yeah.
But it was the last question from Zoom, which was war, conflict, and its
yeah,
relationship
sorry.
to inventiveness.
Yeah.
And we'll wrap it up there.
Sure. So essentially, this is about kind of creative. So the disruptive creation is about balancing between disruption and creation. If all you have is disruption, if disruption is so much that you don't have any creation, then by definition, disruption has gone too far, right? So there's evidence that in later period, we have a period when China also dissolved into different kingdoms, and there was very little creativity that came from that period, right? So we don't know what exactly happened during that period. But you can very well imagine, there are a lot of chaotic societies in history, and there are a lot of chaotic societies in the world. They are not necessarily creative, right? So it is probably, I mean, as a social scientist, we actually know more about necessary conditions. We actually don't know much about sufficient conditions. So chaos is a part of necessary condition. But then, in addition to that, you need to have something else to make it sufficient to produce technology. And we sometimes don't know what that thing is.
Wow, this is an amazing, broad-ranging talk here from such spans of history and also different aspects of politics and inventiveness and what it takes, creative destruction and creative chaos. So thank you very much, Professor Huang. This was a fantastic talk. I'm very welcome.